And according to the young doctor with the cold hands and the expensive watch, I have about 2 weeks left before my lungs finally decide to quit. It's a strange thing to know the expiration date on your own life, but it clarifies things in a way that 40 years of whiskey and silence never could. I sit here on the porch of this rotting cabin, listening to the rhythmic hiss of my portable oxygen tank. A sound that reminds me too much of the hydraulic doors back in Nevada. The sun is setting over the ridge, painting the pines in shades of bruise, purple and black, and for the first time in decades, I'm not watching the tree line out of fear. I'm watching it because I know I'm running out of time to keep my promise. The town down in the valley has called me crazy Rusty since the Reagan administration. A label that stuck the moment I came back here with a dishonorable discharge and no explanation. They think I lost my mind in the service. Or maybe that the isolation up here rotted my brain. But they don't know what I carry in my pocket. I reach into my flannel shirt and pull it out, feeling the familiar weight of it against my palm. It's a stone about the size of a hen's egg, perfectly smooth and worn dark, but 50 years of worry. It isn't a gemstone, and a geologist would probably tell you it's just common river rock, worth more than a fraction of a cent. But to me, this stone is heavier than the entire narrative of my life because it wasn't formed by the river alone. It was chosen. It was carried in a cheek pouch for God knows how many miles before it was pressed into my hand as a payment. A thank you, or maybe a contract. I turn it over and over, feeling the warmth my body has transferred into it, trying to summon the courage to do what needs to be done. My daughter Karen is driving up the switchback road right now, probably cursing the potholes and wondering how quickly she can sell this place once I'm in the ground. She doesn't know that the property deed is the least valuable thing I have to give her. On the small table beside my rocking chair, weighed down by a half-empty coffee mug, sits a photograph that I stole from a classified file in 1972. The edges are yellow and curling, the emulsion cracking like a dry riverbed, but the image is still sharp enough to make my heart stutter. It shows a steel door, reinforced with crossbeams thick enough to stop a truck, torn completely off its hinges. The metal is twisted outward, warped like wet cardboard. The steel bolts sheared cleanly in half by a force that physics suggests shouldn't exist in a biological organism. I look at that photo every morning to remind myself that it wasn't a hallucination, that the pills the VA tried to force on me weren't necessary. That door wasn't opened by a machine or an explosion. It was opened by desperation. It was the result of a father trying to get back to his family. And I was the man standing on the other side with the key card, trembling in my standard issue boots. Most people think of monsters as things that hide under the bed or lurk in the closet, nameless shadows that want to hurt you. But the monster in my life has a file number, a dietary restriction sheet, and a sleep schedule that I memorize better than my own social security number. Week ahead, Imasa 9 in the reports. A way to strip him of any dignity, to reduce a living, breathing soul into a piece of inventory that could be written off or liquidated. But out here, in the quiet of the mountains, where the wind sounds like a voice whispering through the needles, I just called him the old man. He's out there somewhere. I know it. He's probably as gray and stiff-jointed as I am by now, moving slower through the brush, feeling the damp cold in his bones, just like I do. The difference is that he has spent the last half-century free, because I decided to ruin my life, and I have never regretted that transaction for a single second. The oxygen tube chafes against my ears, a constant irritation that grounds me in the present, but my mind keeps drifting back to the smell of that facility. It wasn't the smell of a zoo or a barn. It was the smell of ozone, floor wax, and something underneath it all that smelled like wet copper. That was the smell of fear, sweat. Not his, mine. I was 24 years old. Fresh from a tour in Vietnam that had already hollowed me out, leaving me with a profound distrust of authority and a tremor in my left hand. They put me on the night shift because they thought I was burnt out, useful only for sitting in a chair and watching a monitor. They didn't realize that being broken is exactly what allows you to recognize when something else is being broken. 2. I wasn't guarding a prisoner of war or a criminal mastermind. I was guarding a mistake, a secret that the United States government had dragged out of the deep woods and chained to a concrete floor. I hear the crunch of tires on gravel, the distinct heavy idle of Karen's station wagon pulling up the driveway. My stomach tightens, a knot of anxiety that has nothing to do with dying and everything to do with the truth I've hoarded. How do you tell your only child that the reason you were absent, the reason you were angry, the reason you lived like a hermit wasn't because you didn't love her? How do you explain that you were serving a penance, standing guard over a patch of wilderness because you made a deal with a creature that isn't supposed to exist? She's going to think the dementia has finally set in, that the lack of oxygen is making me hallucinate fairy tales. But then I squeeze the stone again, hard enough to hurt, and I remind myself that proof is a powerful thing. I have the photo. I have the stone. And if the old man is listening, if he still honors the pact we made in the desert dust, I might have more than that. The car door slams. A sharp report that echoes off the canyon walls, followed by the sound of Karen's boots on the wooden steps. She walks heavy, host like Ido, with the purposeful stride of a Boyd. I haven't seen her in 3 years. Not since the argument about the assisted living facility. And I wonder if she's forgiven me or if she's just here to make sure the paperwork is in order. It doesn't matter, I suppose. Forgiveness is a human concept. Messy and complicated. What I need from her tonight is something primal, something older than grudges. I need her to have the instinct to protect something vulnerable. I need her to look at the world not as a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities, but as a place where magic still bleeds through the cracks if you're brave enough to look at it. Dad, her voice is sharp, cutting through the twilight. She's standing at the bottom of the porch steps, squinting up at me through the gloom. I don't turn on the porch light. I prefer the shadows now, and I suspect the old man does too. I'm here, Karen, I say, my voice rasping a little around the plastic tube. An app. The coffee is cold, but the view is still expensive. She hesitates, her silhouette framed against the fading light, and I can see the tension in her shoulders. She's bracing herself for a fight, for a stubborn old man who refuses to go gently into that good night. She doesn't know that the fight is over. The stubborn old man is just a sentry waiting to be relieved of his post. Primera waber, up the stone hidden in my fist. And I pray that the blood of the boy who opened that cage runs strong in her veins. Karen steps onto the porch, and the first thing I notice is that she looks tired in a way that sleep won't fix. She's wearing a blazer that looks too formal for the mountains, and jeans that look too new, the uniform of a woman trying to balance a career and a dying father and failing at both. She drops her bag on the swaying floorboards and looks at me. Really looks at me, inspecting the oxygen tank. The blanket over my knees. The gray pallor of my skin. There's no pity in her eyes, just a calculation of logistics. A mental checklist of hospice care and funeral arrangements. You look like hell, Dad, she says, crossing her arms against the mountain chill. It's affectionate, in her own rough way. We Boyds don't do hugs. We do insults that mask our worry. I'm dying, Karen, I reply, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. I'm allowed to look a little ragged. Sit down. You're making the floorboards nervous. She sits, but she perches on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of trouble. I spoke to Dr. Evans, she says. Getting straight to the point, he says, he refused the morphine drip. He says, you're insisting on staying lucid, even though the pain must be significant. She pulls a pack of cigarettes from her purse, hesitates, then puts them back. Why are you being so stubborn? What is there left to see up here besides squirrels and pine cones? I watch her hands, the nervous energy in her fingers. She has my hands' broad palms, capable fingers, hands that could hold a rifle or a wrench or a secret. I need to be awake, I tell her. There's work to be done. Things I haven't finished. She rolls her eyes, a gesture she's perfected since she was 16. Work. Dad, you've been retired for 20 years. Your work is drinking instant coffee and staring at the woods. It's about the discharge, I say. And the temperature on the port seems to drop 10 degrees. Karen freezes, her gaze snapping to mine. We haven't talked about 1972 in decades. It's the black hole at the center of our family history. The event that sucked in my career, my pension, and eventually her mother. Don't, she says, her voice low and dangerous. Do not start with the conspiracy theories. I cannot handle the government setup speech tonight. I have a meeting in Denver on Tuesday. I am here to make sure you're comfortable, not to relitigate the Nixon administration. She stands up and starts pacing the small length of the porch, her boots thudding angrily. Everyone in town knows you got kicked out for negligence. Dad. Or drugs. Or whatever it was. It doesn't matter anymore. It was 50 years ago. It wasn't negligence, I say quietly, my voice steady despite the lack of air in my lungs. And it wasn't drugs. I opened the door. Karen. I disabled the maglocks. I shorted the keypad with a chewing gum wrapper and a copper wire. And I stood aside. I let him go. She stops pacing and stares at me, her face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief. Let who go? The prisoner. You were an MP at a secure facility. If you let a prisoner go, you should be in Leavenworth, not a cabin in the Cascades. She shakes her head, rubbing her temples. Is this the dementia? Is this what the doctor warned me about? Confabulation? I reach for the manila envelope tucked under my thigh and slide it across the table toward her. Open it, I command, putting a little of the old sergeant into my tone. She looks at the envelope like it might contain a bomb. What is this? She asks, making no move to touch it. It's the reason we were poor, I say. It's the reason your mother left. It's the reason I've spent every night for the last 40 years sleeping with one eye open. She sighs, a long, ragged exhalation, and picks up the envelope. She opens the clasp and slides out the contents. The photo of the twisted door, a heavily redacted incident report I stole from the shredder bin, and a sketch on a napkin. She looks at the photo first, frowning. A broken door, okay? So someone broke out. What does this prove? Then she looks at the report. Her eyes scan the black bars, catching the few words left visible. Asset 9. Biological anomaly. Containment breach. Non-human strength. Asset 9. She reads aloud, her brow furrowing. What was he? A spy? A defector? She looks at the sketch, on the napkin. It's a drawing I made from memory, showing the creature's face, the flat nose, the deep-set eyes, the ridge of bone above the brow. It's not a great drawing, but it captures the sadness in his expression. "Dad," she says slowly, looking up at me with a mix of pity and fear. "This looks like a monkey or a gorilla." She drops the papers back onto the table. "You were guarding a monkey, and you got court-martialed for letting a monkey out of a cage." She laughs, a harsh, brittle sound. "Jesus. Dad, I thought you were going to tell me you killed someone. He wasn't a monkey," I say, and I lean forward, fighting the oxygen tube. He stood 8 feet tall. He weighed 400 pounds. All of it, Marcelin. Hair. And he didn't escape because he was an animal. He escaped because he was a father, and I was the only one who noticed. Karen stares at me, her mouth slightly open. The skepticism is still there, hardened like concrete, but there's a crack in it now. "Bigfoot," she whispers, the word tasting ridiculous in her mouth. "You're telling me you were guarding Bigfoot?" She stands up, grabbing her bag. "Okay, that's it. I'm calling Dr. Evans. We're upping the morphine." "You're hallucinating." "Sit down," I bark, the volume startling both of us. It triggers a coughing fit that rattles my chest like a box of loose bolts. I huck and wheeze, spotting black at the edges of my vision, until I finally get control of my breathing. Karen is at my side instantly, her anger replaced by alarm, her hand on my shoulder. "Dad. Breathe, just breathe." I grip her wrist with my free hand, my fingers digging into her skin. I am not crazy. I wheeze, and I am not hallucinating. I need you to listen to me, Karen, because when I die, he's going to come looking for me. And if I'm not here, he needs to know that you are safe. I release her wrist and slump back. "Please, just listen to the story. If you still think I'm crazy when I'm done, you can drug me to the gills, but give me tonight." She looks at me, really looks at me, searching for the madness in my eyes. She sees the desperation, the absolute conviction that has driven my entire life. Slowly, reluctantly, she sinks back into the chair. She pushes the papers away, but doesn't put them back in the envelope. "Okay," she says softly. "Okay, Dad. Tell me about the monster, but if you start talking about UFOs or government mind control, I'm walking away." I nod, taking a deep pull of oxygen. I look out at the dark tree line, wondering if he's out there listening, wondering if he remembers the night we met. It started in November of 1972. I begin. I was 24, angry at the world, and I thought I had seen everything hell had to offer in the jungle. I was wrong. The facility didn't have a name, just a set of coordinates in the high desert of Nevada, about 90 miles north of anything you'd call civilization. It was buried 3 stories underground, a sterile labyrinth of concrete and fluorescent lights that buzzed with the sound of 1,000 angry hornets. There were no windows, no clocks on the walls, just the constant hum of the ventilation system, recycling the same stale air over and over. I was assigned to Sector 4, the Biological Containment Wing, which sounded impressive until you realized it was just a fancy word for a dungeon. The security clearance was so high that even the guards didn't know what we were guarding until we signed a stack of non-disclosure agreements thick enough to choke a horse. We were told it was recovered biological assets from foreign adversaries. We assumed it was Soviet chimps, or maybe some poor cosmonaut who came back wrong. My shift was the graveyard. 2200-20-600. Standing outside a viewing window made of ballistic glass 4 inches thick. My partner was a guy named Clyde Miller, a corn-fed boy from Nebraska who chewed tobacco and didn't ask questions. Clyde was perfect for the job because he had absolutely no imagination. He saw a prisoner. He saw orders. And he saw a paycheck. I envied him. I saw. They chains. They were industrial logging chains. The kind used to haul redwoods, bolted directly into the concrete floor and shackled to wrists that were covered in thick. Therefore, the prisoner, Asset 9, spent most of his time huddled in the corner furthest from the glass, a massive, shaggy mound of misery that barely moved except to breathe. They kept him on a drip, a cocktail of sedatives that would have killed a battalion of men just to keep him docile. The smell of Sector 4 is something I can still taste if I think about it too hard. It was a mixture of harsh industrial antiseptic bleach and ammonia layered over something muskier, sharper. It wasn't a dirty animal smell. It wasn't the smell of a bear or a dog. It was the smell of stress. It smelled like the inside of a transport chopper before it dropped. That unique biological cocktail of cortisol and sweat that leaks out of men who know they might die. Every time I walked into that corridor, my own body reacted to it. My heart rate would spike. My palms would itch. I knew that smell. I had lived with that smell for 18 months in the Mekong Delta. It was the scent of a sentient being that knows it is trapped. We were strictly forbidden from interacting with the asset. No tapping on the glass, no speaking, no eye contact. The asset is a biological machine, Dr. Leonard Saido, the lead researcher, told us during briefing. Sido was a small man with glasses that magnified his eyes, and a clipboard he held like a shield. It does not have emotions. It does not have language. It mimics. Do not be fooled by anthropomorphic projection. If it looks at you, it is assessing you as a threat or a food source. Sido looked at us at 9, the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, measuring the cuts. I hated him instantly, but I needed the job. I had no skills applicable to the civilian world, and the MP Corps was the only family that would still take me. The cell itself was a white cube, 20 by 20 feet, lit by floodlights that never turned off. There was no bedding, just a drain in the floor for waste and a metal bucket for water. Asset 9 sat with his back to us most nights, his massive shoulders rising and falling with slow, drugged breaths. He was covered in hair that was a dark reddish brown, matted in places where he had leaned against the rough concrete. But his hands, God, his hands were what kept me awake. They were a UJ, easily, twice the size of mine, with thick black leathery pads. But the fingers were nimble. When he thought we weren't looking, he would pick at the shackles, testing the metal with a dexterity that was terrifying the human. He wasn't clawing at them like an animal. He was inspecting the mechanism. On the 3rd night of my 2nd week, the sedative drip malfunctioned. I noticed it on the monitor. Flow rate dropped to 0. I should have called it in. I should have woken Sido. But the silence in the corridor was heavy, and Clyde was dozing in his chair with a magazine over his face. I walked up to the glass, peering into the bright white room. Asset 9 was moving. He had stood up, and for the first time, I saw the sheer scale of him. He was easily 8 feet tall. His head nearly brushing the suspended lights. He turned slowly, the heavy chains dragging across the concrete with a sound like grinding bones. And he looked straight at me. His face wasn't a mask of rage. It wasn't the snarling visage of the monster movies. It was tired. His skin was dark, wrinkled around the eyes like old leather, and his nose was broad and flat. But his eyes were ambered, deep-set, and disturbingly intelligent. There was no predatory glint, no mindless aggression. He looked at me with a profound, weary curiosity. He blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, and then tilted his head slightly to the side. It was such a human gesture. Silent question. "Who are you?" I found myself holding my breath, my hand frozen halfway to my sidearm. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at a prisoner of war. He took a step toward the glass, the chains pulling taut. He didn't smash the window. He didn't roar. He raised one hand, palm open, and pressed it gently against the glass. His fingers were thick, tipped with dark, flat nails. Not claws. I could see the whorls of his fingerprints. The lifelines crossed and recrossed on his palm. He held his hand there, hovering in the space between my world and his, and I felt a jolt of electricity run down my spine that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. He was checking to see if I was like the others, the ones in the white coats who heard him, or if I was just another grunt stuck in a cage. Watching the clock, waiting for the shift to end, I looked over at Clyde, who snorted in his sleep and shifted his tobacco wad. Then I looked back at the asset. Slowly, against every regulation in the book, against every instinct that told me to run, I raised my own hand. I pressed it against the cold glass, lining my small, pale fingers up with his massive, dark ones. For a second, just a heartbeat. We stood there, connected by 4 inches of bulletproof laminate. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise. Then he pulled his hand back, curled it into a fist, and tapped his chest twice. Thump, thump. A heartbeat. He pointed at me, then tapped his chest again. It was a language without words. A simple declaration of shared biology. I am here. You are here. We are both alive. And in that moment, the monster in the cell vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. A friend. Over the next few nights, a quiet understanding developed between us, a fragile truce built on the secret frequency of the graveyard shift. Clyde Miller spent most of his time reading hot rod magazines or dozing with his hat pulled low, convinced that nothing interesting ever happened in a concrete box 3 stories underground. That left me alone with the hum of the ventilation and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the prisoner. I stopped looking at the clipboard with its dietary charts and sedation schedules. Instead, I started watching his hands. They were his voice. When the sedatives wore thin around 0300, his dexterity returned, and he would sit cross-legged on the cold floor. Searching for something in the corners of his cell, he found loose aggregate, small pebbles that had crumbled away from the unfinished concrete near the drain. And he began to collect them in a small pile. He didn't throw them. He didn't try to use them to jam the lock or break the glass, which is what the security manual said a hostile combatant would do. He used them to draw. He would clear a space on the dusty floor with the side of his hand, sweeping away the grit with a motion that looked surprisingly gentle for a creature that could snap a man's spine. Then, he would place the pebbles. Tap. 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 The sound was faint, barely audible through the glass, but I could feel the vibration of it in my boots. He worked with an intensity that I recognized from the artists I'd seen sketching in the parks back home. a total absorption in the act of creation. He would place a stone, tilt his head, grunt softly, and then move it a fraction of an inch to the left. I risked my clearance one night and walked right up to the glass while Clyde was in the bathroom. I needed to see what he was making. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a weapon design. It was a series of circles. He had arranged the gray pebbles into 4 distinct shapes. 2 large circles at the top, and 2 smaller circles below them. He looked up at me as I approached, his ember eyes catching the harsh glare of the floodlights. He pointed a thick, black finger at the largest circle, then thumped his chest. Him. Then he pointed to the second large circle and made a soft, high-pitched cooing sound, a sound I hadn't thought possible from a throat that size. Then he pointed to the 2 small circles. He looked at me, waited for a beat to make sure I was paying attention, and then brought his hands together, interlocking his fingers. The realization hit me harder than a physical blow. It was a family portrait. He wasn't just a biological anomaly found wandering the woods. He was a father. He had a mate and 2 children out there somewhere, probably waiting for him, probably starving without him. The image of the monster crumpled, replaced by the image of a man sitting in a jail cell looking at a wallet photo of his kids. I felt a sudden, sharp sting of shame. I was part of the machine that had taken him. I was the guy holding the keys to the cage, where a father sat drawing his children in the dirt, because he had nothing else left of him. I looked at my own reflection in the glass, ghostly and pale, superimposed over his massive dark form, and I hated what I saw. He seemed to sense my shift in mood. He swept his hand over the drawing, scattering the stones, as if embarrassed that I had seen his vulnerability. But then he did something else. He picked up one of the pebbles, a smooth, dark one that looked different from the rough concrete chips. He held it up to the light, inspecting it, and then popped it into his mouth. He tucked it into his cheek like a wad of tobacco. It was a strange behavior, one I couldn't decipher at the time. I thought maybe he was hungry, or maybe it was a nervous tic. Later, I would learn that he was keeping it safe. He was hiding his only possession in the only pocket he had, his own body. The silence that night felt heavier than usual. I went back to my chair, but I couldn't sit still. I kept thinking about the 2 small circles. I thought about my own dad, a man who worked himself into an early grave at the assembly plant, and how the only time I ever saw him cry was when he lost his wedding ring in the garden. He spent 3 days sifting through the dirt until he found it. That kind of devotion isn't something you can teach an animal. It's a function of the soul. If us at 9 had the capacity to miss his family, to create symbols, to represent them, then keeping him in this cell wasn't containment. It was kidnapping. I tried to tell myself I was reading too much into it. Anthropomorphism, Dr. Cito had called it. Projecting human traits onto a beast. Maybe the circles were just circles. Maybe the hand gestures were just mimicry. But then I looked back through the glass. He had curled up on his side, facing away from the door, his back rising and falling and jagged. Un me hichis. It was a sound I knew intimately from the barracks in Vietnam. It was the sound of a grown man trying to weep without making any noise. Was crying. A 400-pound monster from the nightmares of humanity was lying on a concrete floor, weeping for his children. That was the moment the wall came down. Not the physical wall, but the mental one I had built to do my job. You can guard an enemy. You can guard a criminal. You can even guard a dangerous animal if you respect its power. But you cannot guard a grieving father without losing a piece of your own humanity. I looked at the pistol on my hip, the badge on my chest, and they felt like costumes. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a jailer. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being a good soldier and being a good man might be two mutually exclusive things. I lit a cigarette, my hands shaking, and blew the smoke toward the ventilation. Great. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew I was done following orders. I spent the rest of the shift watching the door. Not to keep him in, but to make sure no one else came in to hurt him. It was a small rebellion, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it was a start. When the morning relief crew arrived, loud and smelling of cheap aftershave, I felt a surge of protective anger. They banged on the glass to wake him up, laughing when he flinched. "Wakey, wakey, big guy." One of them jeered. I grabbed his arm. Harder than I meant to. "Leave him alone," I said, my voice flat and cold. The guy looked at me, surprised by the aggression. "Easy. Rusty. Just having some fun." I didn't let go until he stepped back. I walked out of sector for that morning with a headache that felt like a nail driven between my eyes, knowing that the clock was ticking. The end came 3 days later. On a Tuesday, the atmosphere in the facility changed the moment I swiped my badge at the checkpoint. Usually, the underground levels were quiet, populated only by the skeleton crew of night researchers and board guards. But that night, the hallway outside Sector 4 was crowded with equipment crates, large aluminum cases stamped with biohazard symbols and the logo of a medical supply company in Maryland. I saw surgical lights on rolling stands, trays of instruments covered in blue, sterile cloths, and a heavy-duty hydraulic table that looked more like a car lift than a hospital bed. My stomach turned over. You don't bring that kind of gear for a checkup. Colonel Ford was there, standing with Dr. Sido near the nurse's station. Ford was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and regretted it. He was smoking a cigar, tapping the ash onto the linoleum floor, listening to Sido chatter excitedly about tissue viability and cranial capacity. They didn't notice me. To them, I was just part of the furniture, a grunt with a pulse and a clearance badge. I walked past them, keeping my head down, catching snippets of their conversation. "Window of opportunity is closing," Sido was saying. "Sedation levels must be absolute. We can't have him waking up once we open the thoracic cavity." I felt the blood drain from my face. Open the thoracic cavity. They weren't moving him. They weren't running tests. They were going to cut him open. And from the way they were talking, they weren't planning on putting him back together. I reached the guard station and found Clyde already there. Looking unusually pale. "Big doings tonight, Rusty," he muttered, spitting into a styrofoam cup. "They're prepping for something heavy at 0600. Sent down a whole team of specialists." He nodded toward the desk where a clipboard had been left carelessly on top of a stack of old magazines. Left their playbook right there. I waited until Clyde went to check the perimeter door. Then I picked up the clipboard. My hands were sweating so bad I almost dropped it. The document on top was titled Terminal Exploratory Procedure Subject 9. The word swam in front of my eyes, clinical and cold. Objective: full anatomical cataloging. Primary focus: cardiopulmonary efficiency and skeletal density. Under status, someone had stamped a red block letter word: liquidation. It was a death warrant, typed up neatly on government stationery. They were going to vivisect him. They were going to take him apart, piece by piece, to see how he worked, and then incinerate the leftovers. The timestamp was set for 060 hours. That was shift change. That was 6 hours from now. I looked up at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept around with agonizing slowness. Tick. 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 Every second was a step closer to the knife. I looked through the glass at Asec 9. He was sitting in the center of the cell, not sleeping, not drawing. He was staring at the door. He knew. I don't know how he knew. Maybe he could smell the antiseptic from the hallway, or maybe he could hear the distinct clatter of surgical steel. Animals have a sense for the abattoir. They know when the butcher is coming. He looked small, huddled in on himself, his massive arms wrapped around his knees. He turned his head and looked at me. It wasn't the curious look from before, and it wasn't the sad look of the family drawing. It was terror. Pure, distilled terror. His eyes were wide, showing the whites, and his breath was coming in short, panicked rasps. He rocked back and forth slightly, a motion of self-soothing that broke my heart. He knew he was going to die. He knew that the men in the white coats were coming to hurt him, and he knew there was no way out of that concrete box. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a friend. He saw just another one of the captors. He saw a man in a uniform who was going to stand by and watch it happen. I couldn't breathe. The air in the guard booth felt thick, like I was drowning in syrup. I dropped the clipboard back onto the desk and sat down, my knees giving way. I thought about my career. I thought about the pension I was building. I thought about the court-martial, the prison time, the shame of being branded a traitor. But then I looked at the photo of the two small circles drawn in the dust. If I did nothing, those circles would never be closed. His family would wait for him forever, looking at the tree line, never knowing that he died strapped to a table in a Nevada basement. I remembered a dog I had when I was a kid, a stray mutt that got caught in a trap. My dad wanted to shoot it, said it was to hurt to save. I sat up all night with that dog, feeding it water from a dropper, cleaning the wound. I didn't save it because I was a hero. I saved it because the alternative was watching it suffer. And I wasn't built for that. I looked at us at 9 again. He had stopped rocking. He was just watching me now. A silent plea in those amber eyes. Help me. It was the same look the dog had given me. I stood up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The decision had been made. Not by my brain, but by my gut. I wasn't going to let them cut him open. I didn't care about the colonel or the doctor or the United States Army. I checked the hallway. Empty. The surgical team was probably in the break drinking coffee, mentally preparing for the slaughter. Clyde was down at the far end of the corridor, flirting with the night nurse. I had maybe 10 minutes before the rounds. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a stick of gum. I unwrapped it, my fingers moving with a calm precision that surprised me, and saved the foil wrapper. Then I opened the maintenance panel under the desk and found the copper wiring for the door release mechanism. The plan was crude. The kind of thing you learn in basic training when you need to hotwire a Jeep in a hurry. The cell door was controlled by a magnetic lock system, a failsafe, that required a keycard and a code. But the release mechanism itself was just an electrical circuit. If I could bridge the connection and surge it, the magnets would disengage. It would trigger an alarm, but not instantly. The system had a 3-second delay to verify the fault. 3 seconds. This was all I needed. I stripped the plastic casing off a loose wire with my teeth, tasting the bitter rubber, and twisted the foiled wrapper around the exposed copper. I looked at the camera in the corner of the room. I didn't care. Let them tape it. Let them see who did it. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs until they hurt. and shoved the rigged wire into the open port of the control panel. There was a loud pop, a flash of blue sparks that smelled of ozone. And the panel smoked. The lights in the guard booth flickered and died, plunging me into semi-darkness. Then, the sound I was praying for. The heavy clunkies of the hydraulic seals deep. The red light above the cell door turned green. The lock was disengaged. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the master key for the floor shackles from the hook on the wall and walked out of the booth. I crossed the short distance to the cell door and grabbed the manual release handle. It was heavy, cold steel. I held it down with both hands, straining against the weight. The door groaned, the hinges protesting, and swung open. The smell hit me instantly, that concentrated scent of fear and musk, hot and biological. I stepped into the cell. It was warmer in here than in the hallway. The air thick and humid. Asset 9 was standing in the far corner, pressed against the wall. He looked enormous in the room without the glass separating us. He was a wall of muscle and fur, and he was trembling. "It's okay," I whispered, holding my hands up, palms open. "I'm not gonna hurt you." I moved slowly, keeping my eyes low, trying to look small. Watch it. Me tends to spring. If I wanted to, he could have taken my head off with a single swipe. But he didn't move. He watched the key in my hand. I knelt down by his feet. The shackles were heavy iron cuffs around his ankles. My hands were shaking again as I fitted the key into the lock. Click. The first cuff sprang open. Click. The second one fell away. He was free. I stood up and backed away, toward the open door. "Go," I said, pointing to the hallway. "You have to go now." He didn't move at first. He looked at his ankles, then at the open door, then at me. He seemed confused, unable to process that the chains were gone. Then he took a step, then another. He moved with a silent grace that defied his size. He stopped right in front of me, towering over me, his head blocking out the floodlights. I froze, looking up into that dark, flat-nosed face. I could smell his breath earthy, like pine needles and damp soil. He reached up to his mouth. For a second, I thought he was going to bite me. I flinched, closing my eyes. But he didn't bite. He puffed out his cheek and spit something into his massive, calloused hand. It was the stone, the smooth, dark pebble he had been keeping safe. It was wet with saliva and warm from his body heat. He reached out and pressed it into my hand, closing my fingers over it with a gentle squeeze. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a threat. It was a gift. It was the only thing he owned. And he was giving it to me. He made a low rumbling sound in his chest, a vibration that I felt in my own ribs. It sounded like Hamma. "Thank you." Then he turned and ran. He didn't run like a man. He ran like a fluid force of nature. He cleared the doorway in a single bound, his massive feet slapping the linoleum. I watched him sprint down the corridor, heading for the service elevator I'd left unlocked during my rounds. I saw the maintenance door burst open as he hit it, saw the darkness of the ventilation shaft beyond. And then he was gone. I stood there in the open cell, holding the wet, warm stone, listening to the alarm finally start to wail. Whoop. Whoop. The red emergency lights began to strobe, painting the walls in flashes of bloody light. I heard boots running down the hall, shouting. The sound of weapons being racked. I didn't run. I didn't try to hide. I put the stone in my pocket, walked back to the guard chair, sat down, and poured myself the last cup of cold coffee. When Colonel Ford burst through the door with his service pistol drawn, screaming for a status report, I just looked at him and took a sip. My life was over. But somewhere in the desert night, a father was running home to his children, and that was worth everything. The porch is quiet now. The only sound coming from the wind rattling the dry needles in the gutter and the hiss of my oxygen tank, counting out the seconds. Karen is staring at the table, her hand resting near the manila envelope, but not touching it, her face pale in the gathering dark. She looks at me, then at the woods, 10 back at me, trying to fit the pieces of her father's broken life into this new, impossible picture. "So you let him go," she says finally, her voice flat, devoid of the anger she walked in with. "You let him go. You took the fall, and you lost everything. Mom, your pension, your reputation. All for him." She gestures vaguely at the darkness beyond the railing. It's not an accusation anymore. It's just a statement of fact. A receipt of the cost. I didn't lose everything. I correct her, shift into my chair to ease the ache in my hip. I lost the things that society tells you are important. I lost the nice house in the suburbs and the country club membership. I never wanted anyway, but I kept my soul. Karen. And I kept my promise. I point out toward the ridge, where the silhouette of Black Bear Mountain cuts a jagged line against the stars. Why do you think I bought this cabin? Why do you think I spent 40 years living in a shack with no insulation, freezing my ass off every winter? She looks at the mountain. 10 bake at me, realization dawning slow and cold in her eyes. "Because this is where he went," she whispers. "This is his territory. It's a migration route," I explain, leaning back and closing my eyes for a moment. They move with the seasons. High country in the summer, valleys in the winter. This ridge, this exact spot is a waypoint. I didn't know that in 72. I just knew he ran north. But about 5 years later, when I was working as a logger over in Idaho, I started seeing signs. Not footprintsies. Too smart for that. But markers, broken saplings, twisted in a specific way. Piles of stones near river crossings. The same circles. Karen. The family portrait. I open my eyes and look at her. He was leaving breadcrumbs. He was letting me know he made it. I reach for the lukewarm coffee, my hand trembling slightly more than usual. The exhaustion is setting in, a heavy gray blanket weighing down my limbs. I moved here in 84. Bought this plot for dirt because it has no water rights and the soil is mostly granite. But it sits right on the bottleneck of the valley. If you want to cross from the Cascades to the Rockies without being seen, you have to walk past my back porch. Karen pulls her jacket tighter around herself. "And have you seen him?" Since then, she asks the question, like she's afraid of the answer. Afraid that the monster story is going to become a reality right here on her lap. "I don't see him often." I say honestly, he's careful. He knows the world has gotten smaller. Satellites, drones, trail cameras, getting harder for them to hide. But he visits, usually when the weather turns or when he's passing through with the group. I pause, watching her reaction. He brings me things, not money. Useless things. Mostly a deer antler. Piece of quartz. Once, an old rusted license plate from the 50s. Their payments, Karen. Rent. Or maybe just a way of saying, I'm still here. And I haven't forgotten. Karen stands up and walks to the railing, peering into the black wall of the forest. Skepticism is melting off her, replaced by a primal unease. So, he's out there now? She asks, her voice barely a whisper. You think he's watching us? I nod, though she can't see it. He knows I'm sick. The smell of the sickness rot inside me is strong. Animals smell death on a man long before the doctors diagnose it. He's been coming closer lately. Breaking cover, he knows the sentry is leaving his post. That's why you called me, she says, turning around to face me. You didn't call me to settle the estate. You didn't call me to say goodbye. She sounds hurt, but there's a steeliness under it now. You called me because you need a replacement. I don't flinch from the truth. I'm too old for lies. I called you because you're a Boyd. I say. And Boyds don't walk away from a debt. I saved his life. Yeah. But he saved mine, too. He gave me a reason to wake up in the morning when the whiskey whispered otherwise. Now the watch is ending, and someone has to make sure that door stays open. She looks at me for a long time, searching for the crazy old man she thought she knew, but finding only a tired father asking for a favor he has no right to ask. She looks at the stone on the table, then at the dark woods. I live in Seattle. Duh, she says weakly. I work in marketing. I can't just sit on a porch and guard a Bigfoot. I smile. A dry, cracking sound. You don't have to live here. You just have to keep the land. Don't sell it to the developers. Don't let them pave over the migration path. Just keep it safe. Come up on weekends. Let him know the safe house is still standing. Before she can argue, before she can list all the logical reasons why this is insanity, a sound cuts through the night air. It isn't a howl. It isn't a scream. It's a rhythmic, mechanical hissing sound. Hiss-glunk. Hiss-glunk. Karen freezes, her eyes going wide. What is that? She breathes. Is that your tank? I shake my head slowly, reaching out to turn the valve on my own machine, silencing it for a moment. The sound continues from the darkness beyond the porch stairs. It's a perfect mimicry, a sound he has heard drifting off this porch for the last 6 months. He isn't trying to scare us. He's announcing himself in the only language we share. Karen backs away from the railing, bumping into the table and rattling the coffee mug. Dad, she says, her voice climbing an octave. Dad, there's something in the yard. I struggled to sit up straighter, gripping the arms of the chair until my knuckles turned white. It's okay, I wheeze, turning my oxygen back on. Don't run. If you run, you act like prey. Just stand your ground. Let him see you. The hissing sound stops, replaced by the heavy, deliberate crunch of dry pine needles under substantial weight. It sounds like a horse walking on 2 legs heavy, shifting the earth with each step. A shadow separates itself from the darkness of the pines. At first, it just looks like a darker patch of night, a void where the stars disappear, but then it moves into the faint wash of light spilling from the living room window. And the void gains dimension. He is huge, even stooped with age. He towers over the porch railing, but he isn't the sleek, terrifying giant I met in the cell in 72. Time has come for him, just as it has for me. His fur, once a rich, dark mahogany, is grizzled with patches of grey at the shoulders and muzzle. He moves with a hitch in his left hip, a favoring of the joint that mirrors my own limp. Karen makes a sound in her throat, a strangled gasp, and presses her hand over her mouth. She is seeing the impossible. The myth made flesh, standing 20 feet away in her father's backyard. Asset 9 stops at the edge of the light. He doesn't look at me. He looks straight at Karen. His ember eyes are milky now, clouded with cataracts. But the intelligence behind them is undimmed. He studies her with the same intense curiosity he showed me through the glass all those years ago. He is assessing the bloodline he smells me uneartha. Shared genetics. The same sweat. The Sama fear. He's old, Karen whispers, the terror in her voice giving way to sheer astonishment. My God. Dad. He looks tired. It's the breakthrough I was praying for. If she saw a monster, she would sell the land and never come back. But she sees an old man. She sees a veteran. He is tired. I say softly, it's a hard life out there. Winters are getting colder. Summers are getting hotter, and there are fewer places to rest. Asset 9 shifts his weight, and I hear a low rumble in his chest. A vibration that feels like distant thunder. He isn't growling. He's greeting. He raises one hand slowly. It shakes a little. A tremor that matches mine. He brings it to his chest and taps it once. Thump. Then he points a long, crooked finger at the porch. Not at me. At the empty space beside me. He is asking where the other guard is. He remembers Clyde. He remembers the rotation. He knows that guards change shifts. He is asking if the shift is changing now. I swallow hard, fighting the lump in my throat. Yeah. Old friend, shift change. I look at Karen. She is trembling, tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming reality of it. The world she lived in 5 minutes ago, a world of marketing meetings and traffic jams, has shattered. She's standing in the presence of the ancient, the wild, the secret history of the earth. Karen, I say, and my voice is failing me now. Go to the railing. Show him. She looks at me, terrified. Show him what? She asks. Show him you're their relief. She hesitates, looking at the massive creature, then back at her dying father. She takes a deep breath, wipes her face with her sleeve, and steps forward. She walks to the railing, her boots echoing on the wood. She stands there, gripping the wood, facing the creature. She is shaking, but she holds her ground. She is a Boyd. We are stubborn people. Asset 9 watches her. He tilts his head, sniffing the air, taking in her scent. He steps closer, just one step bringing him almost within touching distance. The smell hits the porch, that familiar musk of pine and earth and old rain. He reaches into the thick fur at his neck. For a second, Karen flinches, but she doesn't retreat. He pulls something out. It isn't a stone this time. It's a pinacon, tight and unopened. Still green, he places it gently on the railing, his massive hand dwarfing the wood. He leaves it there, then steps back. It's a peace offering, a test. He's waiting to see if she accepts the contract. Karen stares at the pinacone, then slowly, tentatively, reaches out and places her hand over it. She looks up at him and nods. Just once. A sharp, definitive nod. I try to speak, to say something profound, but the air just won't come. My lungs feel like they're filled with cement. The excitement, the adrenaline, it's too much for the machinery. I slump back in the chair. The world graying out at the edges. I can hear the hiss of the tank, but it sounds far away, like it's underwater. Karen turns, seeing me collapse, and rushes to my side. "Dad," she cries, grabbing my cold hands. "Dad." "Hold on. I'm calling the ambulance." I shake my head weakly, gripping her fingers with the last of my strength. "No," I rasp. "No ambulances. No sirens. You'll scare him." She looks torn, frantic, looking from me to the creature still standing in the yard. Asset 9 hasn't left. He has moved closer, right up to the porch steps. He is watching us. He knows what is happening. He has seen death in the forest 1,000 times. He knows the rattle of the last breath. He makes a sound, a soft, high-pitched, cooing noise, the same sound he made for his children in the drawing. It's a lullaby, a comfort. He isn't leaving me to die alone. He is standing vigil, just as I stood vigil for him. "Give me the stone," I whisper to Karen. She fumbles in my shirt pocket, pulling out the smooth, dark river rock. She presses it into my palm. It feels cold now, or maybe my hand is just hot. "Take it," I tell her. "You have to take it. He needs to see you take it." She looks at the stone, crying openly now, the tears dripping off her chin. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad," she sobs. "I don't know how to be a guardian." "You just did it," I say, my voice barely a thread. "You stood your ground. That's the job. Just keep the door open." I push the stone toward her. She wraps her fingers around it, covering my hand with hers. We hold it together for a moment. The three of us, the dying sentry, the new recruit, and the prisoner who set us both free. I look past her at the old man. He nods. A slow, solemn dip of his massive head. He accepts the transfer. He understands that the watch is past. The darkness is closing in now, a tunnel narrowing down to a single point of light. I don't feel pain anymore, just a heavy, warm exhaustion. I think about this cell in Nevada. I think about the gum wrapper and the copper wire. I think about the look in his eyes when the chains fell off. It was the best thing I ever did. It was the only thing that mattered. I look at Karen one last time. She isn't the marketing executive from Seattle anymore. She is the woman holding the stone. She is the keeper of the gate. "Tell him." I whisper, the words slipping away. "Tell him he's a good father." My hand goes slack. The stone slips from my fingers, but Karen catches it. She clutches it to her chest, rocking back and forth. I can hear her crying, but it sounds distant, like rain on the roof. The last thing I see is in the cabin, or my daughter. It's the amber eyes of an old friend, watching me from the dark, waiting to guide me onto the trail. The migration is starting. And this time, I get to walk with him. They buried Russell Boyd on the property, right next to the big cedar tree that marks the start of the trail. The town talked. Of course, they said Karen was crazy for burying him up there in the middle of nowhere. Crazy for keeping that rotting cabin when the land prices were skyrocketing. They expected her to sell. They expected the for sale sign to go up the week after the funeral, but the sign never appeared. Instead, the marketing executive from Seattle started coming up on weekends. Then she started taking Fridays off. Then she quit her job and moved up there full-time. trading her pantsuits for flannel and her laptop for a pair of good binoculars. I am Karen Boyd, and I am 54 years old. I sit on the porch now, in the same chair my father died in. The oxygen tank is gone, but the stone is here, warm in my pocket. I've fixed the roof. I've insulated the walls, but I haven't touched the woods. The woods belong to them. It's been 3 years since Dad passed, and the visits haven't stopped. The old man doesn't come around much anymore. I think the winter of 24 was hard on him, but others come. Younger ones. Sometimes I see them moving through the trees at dusk. Dark shapes that move faster than shadows. Sometimes I find things on the porch steps. A twist of willow bark. A feather, once a perfectly preserved geode split in half to show the crystals inside. They know I'm here. They know the name Boyd means safe passage. I found my father's journals in the attic, stacks of them detailing every sighting, every interaction, every thought he had for 40 years. I'm transcribing them now. Not to publish, God, no. Never to publish, but to preserve, to add my own entries to the record. Yesterday morning, I walked out to the porch with my coffee and found something that made me stop in my tracks. There, arranged carefully on the bottom step, were stones, river rocks, hauled up from the creek bed a mile away. They were arranged in a circle, a single large circle, and in the center of it, a small pile of winter berries. It was a memoria, a tribute. The old man might be gone, or maybe he just can't make the climb anymore. But someone remembers. Someone remembers the man who opened the door. I looked up at the ridge, squinting against the morning sun. For a second, just a heartbeat, I saw a figure standing on the rock outcrop. Tall, dark, watching. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. The figure raised a hand-long arm, heavy palm, and then turned and melted back into the trees. I sat down in the rocking chair and rubbed the smooth stone in my pocket. My dad was right. We aren't the masters of this world. We're just the neighbors. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we get to be friends. If you are listening to this, and you feel that pull, that sense that there is something more in the quiet places of the world than just timber and deer, don't be afraid. But don't go looking for them with cameras and guns. Go with respect. Go with a quiet heart. And if you find a circle of stones in the woods, or a strange gift left on a stump, leave it be. It's not for you. It's a conversation between old friends, and some conversations are sacred. The watch continues. The door is open, and I am right where I'm supposed to be.